Facebook's Oversight Board is upholding the company's decision to suspend the account of former President Trump following the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6. However, the board also said the decision to indefinitely suspend Mr. Trump's account was, quote, inappropriate, and ordered Facebook to determine a proportionate response within 6 months. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes has the latest.
We love you. You're very special.
Facebook's new Oversight Board determined today that post and one other severely violated Facebook and Instagram's standards. The posts were from January 6th, during and after the deadly attack on the Capitol. In one, the former president called the insurrectionists great patriots.
We had an election that was stolen from us.
The board said Mr. Trump's unfounded narrative of electoral fraud created an environment where a serious risk of violence was possible. Denmark's former prime minister is one of 20 board members hired by Facebook who scolded the company today for imposing an indefinite ban on Mr. Trump.
It was right of Facebook to remove the content on the 7th of January, but it wasn't right of Facebook to just create a penalty.
Without a Facebook page, it is harder for Mr. Trump to reach his 35 million followers and to raise money and to air ads. But his words have already hit their mark. A recent poll found 70% of Republican voters still believe President Biden did not get enough votes to win the White House. Mr. Biden was asked today about the GOP effort to push Wyoming's Liz Cheney out of House leadership, all because she has repeatedly called Mr. Trump's lie a lie.
They're in the midst of a significant sort of mini revolution.
On his own website today, Mr. Trump backed another lawmaker, Elise Stefanik of New York, to take Cheney's place. Stefanik thanked him for his 100% support.
In a new op-ed, Cheney is not backing down. She says Republicans need to stand for genuinely conservative principles and steer away from the dangerous and anti-democratic Trump cult of personality. But many of her Republican colleagues feel they're going to need his base and his fundraising ability come 2022. Lana?
Nancy, thank you. For more on this, I want to bring in Imran Ahmed. He is the CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Imran, always good to see you. So what do you make of the board's decision to uphold the ban on former President Trump?
Good to see you, Lana. I mean, in one respect, it was a totally unsurprising backing of the notion that President Trump had breached community standards. He'd gone on Facebook and glorified domestic terrorism. He'd glorified acts of extremism, and they were right to note that. However, they appear to have kicked it back for the most extraordinary technicality that they've said there was no official rule allowing them at the time to ban him permanently. And what they've done is, in some respects, tried to apply a sort of a legal argument to a moral question of should they continue to allow someone who habitually lies and spreads misinformation on their platform. And that's in part because this whole sort of Supreme Court for Facebook, it's all a bit of a joke, really. I mean, let's face it, the rules are set by Facebook. They're judge, jury, and executioner, and now they control their own Supreme Court that checks whether or not the decision-making makes sense. Is it any surprise that they themselves are so confused?
So you're clearly thinking that Facebook took a less than moral stance on this, as the argument that you make. So what do you expect will happen in 6 months after Facebook actually reviews its ruling?
Well, who knows? Perhaps they'll finally start applying their rules more effectively. But look, we know that history has shown that these companies are incapable of fully regulating themselves. That's no surprise, right? If Ford set its own standards for cars and safety, if it then was not able to be held liable legally for any harm that's caused by faulty products, and if they have their own court which decided whether or not they're at fault if something terrible happens, well, you'd expect them to defend themselves. Any company would. And Facebook extraordinarily have been given complete impunity from punishment or any kind of liability for the content on their platform in US law under something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, an act written in 1996, 25 years ago, before social media even existed. And now we have a situation where they seek to regulate themselves. It's really, all this is showing is that it's time for regulation to happen. We know that legislators are looking at this really hard. There are a number of bills before the US Congress, and both the Republicans and the Democrats have stated their desire to see change. What today has been is really a bit of theater, but just proving one thing, that Facebook can't be trusted to regulate itself.
CBS This Morning co-host Tony DeCoppel interviewed Helle Thorning-Schmidt, one of the co-chairs of Facebook's Oversight Board. She's also the former Prime Minister of Denmark. I want to play part of their conversation.
But, Madam Prime Minister, as the board pushes the decision back to Facebook, aren't you asking them to invent whatever standards they want to?
No, we are asking them to use their own standards. And Facebook has actually got standards. They can give strikes to users. They can permanently close a user's account. They can also give a time-bound sanction and then say to the users, you can come back. And in the case of this user, Mr. Trump, they also have to assess whether there's still harm to what that user might post. So there are actually clear rules within Facebook themselves in their community standards to which penalties and sanctions they can use. But in this case, they chose not to use any of these, but use an indefinite penalty. And they can't do that. And that's what we're telling Facebook today.
Imran, what do you make of that explanation?
Well, it seems really convoluted, because what she's saying is that Facebook have rules, that they've tried to apply them, they've actually failed to apply them and invented new rules. Then they've pushed it to the Oversight Board and said, are we following our rules? And the board have said, what rules? You just made them up for this particular situation. And I guess that shows what a joke the sort of the notion of an oversight board in this current configuration is. And I mean, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, who is a great Democrat, she's someone who's run a democracy, Denmark. She should really know better that you can't possibly have the same people who are in charge of setting the rules, acting as judge, jury, and executioner, and then also administering the appeals court. $130 million is what Facebook spent on setting up the appeals court. There are 20 members of that oversight board. They're each paid six-figure salaries in order to do 15 days a year of work. And it's run by Mark Zuckerberg's former speechwriter. That's no way to run any kind of accountability body, is it?
Well, in a post on Medium, an outside group of scholars and experts who call themselves the Real Facebook Oversight Board wrote something that agrees with your opinion on this. Quote, this decision does nothing to root out the deep systemic content issues plaguing Facebook. So, Imran, Facebook is under no obligation to follow the recommendations of the Oversight Board or address the larger issues impacting its platform. Do you think that public pressure will have any effect?
Look, I think that, if nothing else, 2020 showed us. It showed us two things. First of all, the great power of social media, because it was the primary means by which we kept ourselves sane, communicated, expressed love, vulnerability to people in a time when we were all locked down. But 2020 decisively showed, whether it's COVID deniers, it's anti-vaxxers, it's white supremacists, or it's electoral misinformation that led to the riots at the U.S. Capitol down the road from where I live on January the 6th. It's shown that what happens online has an offline cost. That is paid in lives when it comes to things like January the 6th. And let's never forget that on that day, people died. And so it's really important that we get it right now.
Well, I also want to play another clip from Tony DeCoppel's interview with Helle Thorning-Schmidt, because she was asked how the Oversight Board views Facebook in the public sphere. Let's take a listen.
The big question that lingers in all of this is, what is Facebook? And when a person goes onto Facebook, is it like walking into a bar, a private place, or is it like walking out onto a public street corner where you should have all sorts of protections for free speech? How does the board view what Facebook is in the world?
Well, Facebook is a new thing, and I think that's why it's so interesting for all of us to discuss it. Facebook is certainly not a news outlet. where you have certain responsibilities. And Facebook is not going into a bar either, because in a bar, when you sit at a bar, they don't come to you and say, we have community standards of what we can say here, or we try to abide by human rights. What is not so good is that there's still not enough transparency about these rules and how they actually use them in the actual decision. So this is why the Oversight Board is here, to make sure that we get that transparency and that all the users are equal and are treated as equal.
So she describes Facebook as a kind of news organization. I'm wondering, where do you think social media networks belong in our public discourse?
I think it was a brilliant question that was asked. Is it like a bar or is it like the street corner? And she said it's not like the bar because bars don't have community standards and they don't abide by human rights standards. I'm pretty certain that most of the bars I've ever been to abide by human rights standards, and they have community standards that if I stood up on a table and started shouting nonsense or shouting, insulting someone else, trolling someone, that I'd be kicked out of that bar. And Facebook earn revenue from every single eyeball on their platform. They profit from the content that's generated by other people, and they profit from the attention that's generated by controversy. For too long, they've been addicted to the profits that come with the traffic generated by highly controversial content, including President Trump. In many respects, he's a creature of Facebook. He was created by social media platforms that amplified his rhetoric because it was the most engaging and controversial, shoved it up timelines, made it look as though it was much more popular than it was. And now they're reaping the problems that they've sown.
All right. Imran Ahmed, thank you.